Hello, and welcome to Cinema Analytics. Today we're going to look at the box office performance of Blackish movies. What are Blackish movies, you say? Well, for the purpose of this analysis, I am defining Blackish movies as movies produced by and starring Black actors, or just generally marketed or targeted toward Black audiences. For the sake of this analysis, I am not including unambiguously Black actors like The Rock or Vin Diesel. They both play more as multi-ethnic than Black. We will also place these Blackish films into one of two buckets. One bucket will be the modern context. That will include movies like Ride Along, Tyler Perry's Madea movies, and Get Out. The second bucket, or context, will be pre-civil rights era films. These will be movies like Selma, Marshall, which is the film about Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall's legal challenge to school segregation, and Hidden Figures. I will also include the movie Mudbound. Mudbound did not have a theatrical release, at least not in the United States, but it was budgeted and intended as a theatrical release, so it is included in this dataset. The list of Blackish movies we're going to include will be movies starting in the year 2014 and going up to and including the year 2017. The list will include films that were in the top 150 grossing films of that year. And the list in all is a total of 35 Blackish films. The lowest theatrical grossing film in this data set is Dear White People, which grossed $4.4 million in 2014. And the highest grossing film in this data set is going to be last year's Get Out, which grossed $176 million. Right now we're looking at the sum total gross of all movies. And on this chart we have a green line in the center of the screen, running across the center of the screen here. And it's giving us a total of 272 million average gross per year. So for the Blackish films per year, there's an average gross of 272 million. The blue line up here, the blue line tracks the grosses for the modern era movies. You can see, for instance, for 2014, modern films, it's a total of 430 million, whereas for 2014, it's only 62 million. Take a quick look at the average grosses for these movies. And once again, our green reference line here is giving us the average gross, which is 53 million, almost 54 million. So that's 54 million per movie on this list, on this graph. The blue line again is tracking the modern movies. And for instance, in 2014, each modern film averaged about 53 million, whereas the pre-civil rights era films only averaged 31 million. So let's take a closer look at the total grosses for the modern era movies. We can see that there's an average gross per year of 392 million. And on our graph here, we see that there's 430 million in 2014, and that that the graph dips in 2016 to 308 million, and then recovers in 2017 to 395 million. Looking at the pre-civil rights era movies, we can see that there's this huge peak in 2016. And that's because we not only had Hidden Figures at 169 million, we also had Fences, which came out that year, which made a pretty decent amount of money, particularly for this particular genre. And it made about $58 million in 2016. So 2016 was a high watermark year for pre-civil rights era movies in this data set. And you can see in 2017 was not a very good year for that particular, those particular type of movies, earning just $29 million off of 3 movies. Now, I have Mudbound here, and you can see there's an asterisk right next to it. So, Mudbound was not released. Um, it's a film that had a pretty significant budget, but the movie did not have a theatrical release in the United States. There were some dates where it played in theaters overseas, but not in the United States. Eventually, Netflix purchased the movie for 12.5 million. And I'll talk a little bit later exactly why I used the figure $12 million when I added it as the box office gross in this data set. For the modern context movies, average gross, there's an average gross of $64 million. That's for each modern context movie. And you can see kind of it's a little bit up and down, but that's fine. And that there's an average of about 6.8, about 7 movies per year, which are Blackish movies in a modern context. If we look at the pre-civil rights era movies, we have an average of 40 million, about 41 million. And again, here's our peak with an average of 81 million. That's off of 3 movies, Hidden Figures, Fences, and Birth of a Nation. And once again, we see that it drops down again in 2017 with an average of $9 million in 2017, and that's off of Mudbound, Marshall, and I Am Not Your Negro. We're now looking at the outlier chart, and the outlier chart is a bubble chart. Each one of the bubbles is a film. The blue bubbles are modern context movies, whereas the gold bubbles are the pre-civil rights era movies. You'll notice that you have some of these bubbles which are a bit more spread out and isolated, whereas you have other bubbles which are concentrated. And that's one of the benefits of using a bubble chart. It can help you clearly see where your outliers are. So some of these movies, you'll notice, for instance, if I take Hidden Figures from the data set, and actually let me go back and separate these by context first. This is the modern context movies, and this is the outlier bubble chart with the pre-civil rights era movies. And you can clearly see now that for pre-civil rights era movies, Hidden Figures really stands out. So if I deselect it, take it out of my data set, you can see it affects the chart. We also have these other 2 movies, Fences and Selma. There's a huge spread between these 2 movies and the movies down here. So if I go ahead and take out Fences and also remove Selma, all right. And so now they're all still pretty much clustered together. If we look at the modern era movies, we can do the same thing, right? Take out Get Out. Affects the chart somewhat, but really not that much. And that's because you have these other 2 films that are kind of close to it, but they're also a bit spread out. And we can remove those also. So we have Straight Outta Compton. And actually, instead of doing that, I've actually already gone ahead and created sets of a set with all the outliers in it. And so what I'm going to do is just go ahead and add all these titles back. And I have this set of radio buttons here that I can select. If I select false, that'll take all the outliers out of the data set. And we can see for modern films, everything's still pretty clustered up together here. And for pre-civil rights era, the movies that were outliers are in the outlier data set, and they're being filtered out of the data set. So everything is, we have a nice distribution here. And so from there, we can go ahead and look back at our initial data. Okay, so now we're looking at the summary gross again, but this time with all of the outliers taken out. If we want to take a quick look at what those outlier movies are, we can just select true for outliers over here. And these are all the data points, all the movies that are not going to be in our data set. So right along The Equalizer, Selma, from all those movies from 2014, and from 2015, Straight Outta Compton and Creed. From 2016, Hidden Figures and Fences. And from 2017, Get Out and Girls Trip. So I'll go ahead and take those out again. And now we're looking at our data set with the outliers filtered out. And we can see already that we don't have that peak in 2016 that we did when we had, it was Fences and Hidden Figures in 2016. They were dramatically changing the shape of this graph. Earlier we saw that, if I put it back in real quick, we saw that it was almost the same as the modern films. For the grosses were almost the same for modern films with pre-civil rights era movies in 2016 because of Hidden Figures and Fences. And we also saw that with the averages, where the average pre-civil rights era movie eclipsed the grosses for the modern era movies. With those with Hidden Figures and Fences in the data set. But we'll go ahead and take those back out again. And we're back to looking at the sum total. So with those taken out, you can see here that the pre-civil rights era movies, the graph here is much flatter. We can go ahead and select pre-civil rights era only and see just how flat it is. We can also look at the average gross for pre-civil rights era movies with the outliers out. And you can see that it's still very flat. So I mentioned that I gave Mudbound a figure, Mudbound a figure of $12 million. And the way that I did that, the way that I came up with that was that after I had, earlier I had created my outlier set and filtered it out, and I didn't have Mudbound in the data set. So with Mudbound not in the data set, and with my filtering of the outliers out of the data set, I looked at what the average was. And the average gross for these movies, for these pre-civil rights era movies with those outliers out, was $11,700,000. So I just rounded it up to 12 million. And I was a little bit surprised at that because, like I said before, Netflix paid $12.5 million. So I don't know if that's just a coincidence or not, but it's at least very interesting that this average here is about what Netflix paid for Mudbound. So let's go ahead and look at the average for the modern films with the outliers taken out. And at least the shape of it still pretty much looks the same. We have an average gross of 40 million with the outliers taken out for the modern context movies. For the pre-civil rights era movies, that average with the outliers taken out is about 12 million per year, as we already established. All right, I want to take a little moment here and look a little bit closer at some of these modern movies. And if you look at some of the movies that are at the bottom, these are lower performing movies like Dear White People and Black and White and Loving, which came out in 2016. And those movies, although they are modern, they have very heavy racial themes. So they're sort of in a subgenre of their own. And so I created a set for what I call modern racial theme movies. And that way I can, if I want to just look at those particular type of movies, we can see that they average about $11 million per year. It's a small data set, but I think it's very significant. And it's also a bit amazing, or not coincidental, that this average per year, let me go to my averages actually. Okay, so I'm looking at the average gross of each movie, and it's 11,242,000. And that's very close to the same value that we have for our pre-civil rights films, pre-civil rights era movies, with the outliers taken out. So here are all of our pre-civil rights era context movies with the outliers taken out, and you can see this average of 11,720,000. That is very similar to what we see when we look at the modern context movies with a racial theme or racial component to them. 11,242,000. So with about 4 times the average gross as pre-civil rights era movies, the modern context movies should you should have about 4 times as many modern context movies as the pre-civil rights era movies in this current data set. And once you add into the fact that the modern context movies, which have a heavy racial theme, these films here, if you add them to the count of the pre-civil rights era movies, that gives you about 2 movies per year. Whereas with the modern context movies, it's 4.5, but the average gross is 4 times those other types of movies. So really, you would think optimally that you would have about 8 movies per year in this particular distribution of modern movies. It should, because it's 4 times the average gross, it should be 4 times the number of movies. That would give you about 8 movies per year. So what we're seeing here right now is half of the modern context movies that Hollywood is putting out, or at least in this data set, we're seeing about half of what it should be. And to me, I think that means that there's maybe just a little bit too many of these pre-civil rights era movies. I don't think that there's really much of a demand for them from Black audiences. So that's just my take on things. What do you think? Do you think that there are too many of these pre-civil rights era context movies? Do you think there are too many movies that have a heavy racial theme? Do you think there are some movies in the data set that should have been included? And what do you think about removing the outlier data? If you have any comments, please leave them below. I'll also have a link to the report on Tableau Public. That's it for now. Thank you for watching.